let's start with the first presentation of mine, which is around what is happening in gaming, what we can look at what is gaming and non-gaming, because it includes in non-gaming as well in 2024. So in this case, what is the situation in gaming? What is the kind of deeper view on mobile part on gaming, and what is actually happening in mobile apps? So I hope there will be, of course, a lot of data. I hope useful and interesting for you as in the past. Again, just to remind, people can ask questions during the presentation, and then they can actually, we will answer them at the end. Okay, if we start from situation in gaming, it's still the market that is growing. So that's the expectations for the growth of the gaming for the next years. So this year, the gaming is expected to have 2.7 billion of people and expected to grow around between 150 to 100 millions every next year. If we look at the what is really the penetration of gaming in different markets, that's the estimation of penetration based on very recent data of Statista coming from October 2023, so very recent, where we see those waves of like penetration in gaming. We see, of course, a very strong one in Asia, especially in China, very strong one in Western Europe, US, and of South America. And then what is happening now, what we can expect in the future, which markets will grow. That's actually quite interesting data that is showing, here we have the percentage, so it's like 7 percentage points, which means that if we look at the data now in 2023, and then we look at 2027, so we see those like 4 years of differences, where actually we expect the highest growth of this gaming in the next years. So we see that actually in more or less still, if we look at the map in terms of penetration now and penetration data, we see that many areas that have very strong penetration now, they actually expect to grow in the future as well, with a few exceptions. Yes, so for sure, one region that is expected to grow quite significantly by terms of the penetration in gaming is, of course, Africa, especially markets like Nigeria, and in general, like eastern part of Africa. But then, of course, like Western Europe, and of course, China, and then South America as well. The South America is that region that actually more and more companies are looking at, especially if they have the business model based more not only on the in-app purchases but on the ads as well, because that is actually very ads-driven market. Then we can go further, which is even it's getting quite interesting even in the way what is in general the size of the gaming market. Probably the most well-known data around the size of the market is coming from Newzoo, where they kind of estimate the size of the market in gaming for around 187 billion. That's actually, I would say, the most popular and most well-known numbers, but there are actually other companies that try to count it differently. And actually, in many cases, even they show even bigger size. Yes, so for example, like Statista is estimating that even based on the different data sets for around 330 billion, and Pricewaterhouse around 260. So even some basic stuff not always is kind of defined very well. If we go deeper, and we go deeper by the Newzoo, because that's probably one of the most comprehensive data sources around gaming. This business in 2023 is defined and the combined from 3 main parts, of course: mobile, which is expected to be around 92 billion, console, and PC. If we look at the growth for the next years, I would say almost all parts of gaming are expected to grow. The highest growth rate is expected to be for the console, between like 7 to 10 percentage points year over year for the next 3 to 4 years. A little bit lower mobile. Again, we are talking about in-app purchases here. In this case, it's expected to grow around 3 to 5 percentage points, and then like PC is actually supposed to be quite stable, not really changing in terms of the data. If we look at the like combined growth for the next years, so that's actually combination of like the growth for the next years. So again, the highest combined growth is expected to be for console, then for mobile, and then for PC between 2023 and 2026. Which is actually one of the reasons why in some cases there is actually more focus on console than it used to be in the past. It looks like a bit differently if we look at the users, because if we look at the users by user perspective, of course, mobile is the broadest and the widest market. It's around almost 3 to like 2.8 billion, where like PC or like console is supposed to have around 900 and 600. And then if we look at the data for by the platforms, that's more or less the estimation for the sizes of the audiences for different platforms. And of course, we see that Apple and Android as the mobile, they are like the widest, and that's actually in general mobile gaming is based on not only core audience but casual audience. That's why if we look together, it's actually really big audience. Versus the stores are of course much more core audience and oriented, and that's why they are way more concentrated by the size of the population and the size of the groups. If we go deeper, if we compare the players that are expected to be growing for the next years, so that's estimation for the growth of the players. So actually, in this case, the highest growth rate is expected to be for the mobile part. So in general, by the revenue, like console is going to be, I would say, highest growth. But in terms of the users, we see the highest growth on the mobile side, followed by the console and PC. But what is actually quite interesting as well is that there is more and more data around the ads part of the business as well. It's actually quite hard to estimate that ad side. I would say probably the only company that they tried so far, and they did it very recently this year, between the May and October 2023, it was Statista. That was actually trying to estimate the size of the in-game advertising. So like the value of the all in-game business based on the mostly advertiser sites. Yeah? So they were connecting with a lot of media houses, with a lot of agencies, a lot of advertisers, trying to more like understand the value of the market more from the advertiser sides than from the publisher side, because actually that was a little bit easier to do. And it's based on their estimations, really huge part of the business. So in this case, they divide the markets a little bit differently. In this case, that's how they estimate the market, where like we see the mobile games, and then we have separate in-game advertising, where it's combining both like in-game market in all platforms, but of course majority of that part is on mobile. And what is actually quite interesting, based on the estimations, it will be quite strongly growing part for the next years. So that's why it's actually, I think it's good that more and more data is coming around the topic, because based on that we can see that the real size of the market is actually much higher than we expect. Because in most of the analysis of the market, very often this in-game advertising is not really included, because it's mostly based on the data sources like in-app Ani, so then there is not much data around this part of the market. If we go deeper and we look at how that market is actually estimated to be in different places, that actually maybe not the most, not the clearest comparison from the statistical point of view, because we are comparing different data sources. Again, it's not maybe the clearest and the best approach from the mathematical and statistical point of view, but still actually gives some idea how that market behave. So in this case, we have comparison of like in-app data based on the data AI and in-game advertising based on Statista, and we see actually how that in-game advertising actually how big is versus in general as the part as the whole of the business. So of course we can see that it's really big. Actually, we can it's quite big in US. It's almost kind of half of the in-app revenue. It's quite big in countries like Japan, but there are some markets actually, like for example India, where this in-game advertising actually even much bigger than in-app revenue. And if we look at the estimation of the growth for the future, that's actually getting quite interesting as well, because we see that this in-game advertising is especially supposed to grow, especially in China and US. In China, actually, this in-game advertising is supposed to be even higher than in-app. But of course, in China, it's very hard to even estimate that in-app. But still, we see very strong growth for the next years, especially again in China. Quite nice growth for in US. When in this case, you know, if we look at the we are here, so it's like it's supposed to be like going by almost 60% during the next 3-4 years. So it's actually really significant growth. Even if the data is not 100% precise, it's still giving the idea that the market will be really growing. If we go deeper and we exclude those biggest markets like China and US, because then it's easier to see some other potential markets, we see that markets like, for example, in this case, UK, here we have pretty nice growth as well. Almost, if we have kind of here, almost like by around 50% during the next more or less 4 years combined. And then, of course, for example, India here, where again, it's almost supposed to be like going by 60 to 70% for the next 3-4 years. So again, quite big portion of the market. Okay, so that's the like base view. Let's go a little bit deeper. So let's try to look at these types of the data, looking at how the gaming is kind of deeper in by the view. So let's start from the business data. So if we look, for example, in gaming in general, and we look at how that market is actually driven, console versus mobile versus PC, it's very easy that, for example, console is very Western Europe and US driven. So actually, if we look at the North America and Western Europe, actually the console part is extremely big, versus in markets like Middle East, Central Asia, or like especially Africa, even Eastern Asia, that console market is relatively much smaller. So that's why in general, of course, this if we look even by the perspective, like for mobile companies, topics like localization, topics like understanding the smaller market is actually much bigger topic than, for example, in console, where that's very driven by the top markets. If we go deeper and start to compare the data, we see that there are some quite significant differences in terms of what genres are actually popular in different devices. So for example, let's look at, if we compare mobile, console, and PC, for Northern America, for example, we see that, okay, on mobile, we see, for example, really big puzzle versus, for example, on console, we have, of course, Battle Royale and some other genres, like, for example, sports games as well. If we go deeper and we start to look at how actually this audience differs by different devices, there is not so much data around that, but there is pretty interesting one coming from consumer insights, where if we look at some markets and we look at, for example, how this gaming audience is different by markets, there is not so much difference in this case. Of course, in some markets, we have a little bit more of these older audiences. Even if we go even deeper and we, for example, look, okay, let's look at the US audience and let's compare it by the device. There are some differences coming, for example, from the point that, okay, some like, let's see, console is actually, bigger, for example, in this audience 2029, but still by the size, of course, the mobile will be bigger because, again, the mobile is much wider audience. Of course, that actually in some way it compares and actually in some way combines with those differences by the different regions, yeah. Because even if we look and if we go deeper and we start to look at, again, for example, how those audiences differ by the different regions, we see that, okay, this gaming audience in general, that audience even will differ even by the situation. That, for example, let's see the Western Europe or Northern America is actually kind of quite old countries where we have less and less young people versus, for example, if we look at Africa and Latin America, the share of the younger audience is much higher, which in some way is actually driving, for example, some growth of mobile there as well. But still, if we go even deeper and we look at the data kind of deeper by the perspective of, okay, what the users want, we see that there's, of course, more and more discussion around this cross-platform approach. And we see that even the users actually will be demanding that more and more. There is very interesting research that was done not long time ago. This was done around around February 2023. It was not very well known because it was done by Stadia team. So of course we know what happened to Stadia. So that's why was one of the reasons it became not very popular. But what was actually very interesting, it was when there was the question, okay, which trends do you see and which trends as the gamer you want to focus on? This cross-platform actually was very visible, followed by, for example, by this browser-based or like HTML5. Again, those it's not the accidents that we see more and more actually discussion around those types of gaming experiences. Even if we look at the users' recognition of the different platforms, it's still much higher. So, for example, in this case, when the people were asked, okay, what do you know? What you are aware of? So, okay, people were aware that there is existing VR, that exists eSport, that actually, there are those amazing technologies out there, but still they were much less interested by that than by, for example, very, let's call it simple, but still quite complex from the technical perspective, this, cross-platform, cross-device experience, yeah? That's why I would say that the next years in the gaming will be probably by the discussion around the new technologies like VR or AR, but even more by this focus on this cross-platform approach, especially that if we go deeper by that data, we see that on one side, this cross-platform approach is actually even more awaited in those markets that are younger and they are more developing, because in this case, in this very quite recent research as well, when people were asked, okay, if your current mobile game you are playing is developed as the PC, would you play it or would you buy it? Then we see that actually the expectation of this cross-platform experience actually even stronger on these emerging markets. Even combined with that, with the data, that if that topic was kind of measured and analyzed more in the Western markets, like in US, we see that the younger audiences were seeing that as more appealing, which is actually combining two points, yeah? So on one side, we see that more emerging markets are driving that, where by definition, actually, there is higher share of the younger audience than the Western markets, which means that by percentage, those numbers would be even higher, for example, Indonesia, for example, than in US, because again, there is much, much higher share of the younger audiences in those markets. Okay, that was around the different types of gaming experiences, but what is happening deeper in terms of the mobile? So if we look at the very recent data, the last month was extremely good, because if we look at that's the data showing year-over-year growth. So each number is actually showing that growth of the gaming market versus the previous year. So we saw, pretty nice growth during the COVID, then decline, of course, after the COVID, when we had really big base here. But then the last months are actually, we see stronger improvement on the gaming side, including that the last month was extremely good, because actually in September this year we had even double-digit growth rate on Android, which was something we didn't see for a long time already, which is, I think, good sign. Let's see. Let's keep fingers crossed how it will go for the next months. If we look at iOS, on iOS, this growth is a bit lower, but just at the first sight, because it's what's happening is that this is the whole iOS revenue on gaming, but includes actually quite a lot of Chinese revenue, because China is quite a big market for iOS. So if we, from that data, if we exclude China, which has pretty challenging times now, mostly for political reasons, then the data for iOS is actually much, much better. So we see even again, the same as for Android, the data on the iOS side is actually improving quite nicely as well. If we go deeper and we go details, how it's actually how that revenue and how the data is changing by country. So let's start from Android. So we see, okay, more or less that average for the whole market. Of course, US, if we look at the 3 quarters of this year, so January to September 2023 versus January to September 2022. Of course, the data is sorted by the revenue, yeah, which means that the earlier the market, the bigger revenue from that market. So of course, US is the biggest, but it's below the average. We see actually that most of the growth was coming from tier 2 and tier 3 markets. So in this case, okay, those markets like Germany or UK, they had small growth, but of course the markets like even Poland, Netherlands, Indonesia, or for example France had quite much higher growth than average. If we look at the markets sorted by the downloads, so of course still India is the biggest market in terms of the downloads, but it's what's happening even in those emerging big markets like India and Brazil. We see actually stabilization of the downloads. It's just more growth on the revenue side, which means that we can expect that those markets will be better monetizing on one side, but then on the other side, they will have more pressure on the CPI in user acquisition as well. Because again, the revenue goes higher than downloads, which means that the monetization is growing. So then the pressure on CPIs will be growing. Okay, so if we go deeper and we look at the iOS data, then we see that okay, on iOS we have even slightly growth on the US. We have very strong decrease on China, so that's why actually China is influencing so heavily the iOS data. So that's why whatever data you see about iOS, ask if it includes China or not, because again, China has a pretty strong influence on the whole iOS data on the both revenue and download side. And then most of the growth actually on iOS was coming from tier 2 and tier 3 markets as well. So that's actually, I think, what is changing on the market, that in the past year, every company had the strongest focus on US, even in, for example, in user acquisition, because it was the easiest to go over the Apple thresholds with the bigger scale campaigns. But then the market is actually learning even how to actually approach those acquisition campaigns even on smaller markets. So that's why I would say, at least that's my theory, that one of the reasons why those smaller markets like France, Thailand, Switzerland, Singapore, they see really nice growth on the iOS side. And actually, most of the growth on iOS comes from those tier 2 and tier 3 markets. If we look at the all genres and market combined together, then it of course creates quite difficult and quite complex scenario. So we see that this situation is way more complex than just looking at the average. So here we have the year-over-year data combining Android and Apple together, when we have a few top gaming genres and with top a few markets. So we see that in general, there are some markets that are getting heavy on some genres, like for example, those, South Korea, for example, it was they had very strong growth of like education and some family-based topics in the past, but they created quite strong base now. So then now it's actually declining. We see, of course, some genres sometimes being influenced by just a few games. So if you look, for example, at board, a lot of that genre is just influenced by the Monopoly Go, that is just having like more than $100 million monthly revenue. So sometimes even one game can actually shape the whole category. And then of course there is kind of discussion how the core genres are behaving. If we look at the data for downloads, we see that actually in many countries and many genres, we see kind of higher growth for the revenue than for downloads. You see that in general, we see, I would say, more extreme on the revenue side and more, I would say, even on the download side, but still in many genres, actually, the downloads are growing slower than revenue, which of course is actually showing the growing competition there as well. With that, of course, still it's kind of we can ask ourselves, okay, it's possible to achieve success on mobile in 2023. It is. That's actually quite interesting data showing top games by the revenue, like top games. And what we see is actually two colors. The blue one is kind of the base revenue from the previous year. And then we see the brown. If that game this year is much bigger than the previous one. Yeah, so it's still, of course, we see that there is a lot of games that are very strong this year and they were very strong last year. But we see a few very interesting points, like, of course, Dream Games and Royal Match is actually phenomenal and very strong game from Turkey. Then we have really good, extremely good results for the Honkai. It's actually the game from China that is actually very popular in many countries, and of course Monopoly Go, which again from zero came to like 600, like 500 million during the just few months starting from April. So again, mobile is very competitive, but still it's possible just to enter the market and really just create very high value out of nowhere. Of course, if we look at the market deeper, we see how actually that market is actually changing as well. So for example, if we look at the Monopoly Go as the example, so that's the growth of the revenue month by month. So they started from April, and then we see coming to more or less September, where we have more or less around 100 million per month. And then if we look deeper, it's actually quite interesting to compare how this mobile evolved if we compare Monopoly Go and Pokemon Go. Those games are kind of sometimes compared with each other in the way they have the very strong IP. They kind of focus on very specific audience. So that's we see kind of two similar months in the history of those games. So we see August 2023, September 2023 for Monopoly Go. And then, like a few years ago, even stronger, but more or less similar months for the Pokemon Go. Yeah, the difference is that what was happening earlier. Yeah, because if we compare those games, we see that Pokemon Go was coming out of nowhere, became extremely big, and then we have actually pretty nice and stable size, but of course much lower than before. Versus here we see actually how this market and how that gaming became way more professionalized. Yes, so it's like we see how the game was improved with every next improve of the metrics. It was growing the scale, but step by step, even to the extent that if we compare, for example, which markets that game was available at, starting when we can actually divide that game into three main periods. The first one, it was in the previous year, 2022, where that game we see that more or less had this technical soft launch, was actually available mostly with Philippines. That's actually just getting the users. Then we have the second phase happening from January to April, when more and more markets were actually added to the size and to the basket, checking how actually that game performing. And then finally, when someone saw the game is good, then starting from the April, let's move everything to US, and then we see really big scale. So finally, we see that's the first phase, that's the second one, and then big money on the third one. Yeah, again showing how actually this gaming evolved, how actually it became way more professional, requiring much more preparation than in the past. And we even can see it actually by the metrics, for example. Yeah, if we compare the metrics of Monopoly Go based on the data AI and Pokemon Go, we see that Monopoly Go has extremely good retention, between 40 to 50% for day 2, and around 15% for day 30. And we compare, that Pokemon Go it actually has really good metrics as well. But what is interesting to see how actually those metrics were changing. If we look at I don't see it. But there is one data that actually showing that day 30 on Pokemon Go in like beginning of the year, it was around 5%. And then every next 2 months, it was almost doubling. So again, new features, new content, and then we have really strong success. So finally, actually, if we look at the monetization, everyone told that, for example, Pokemon Go success cannot be repeated. But if we look actually by the data, Monopoly Go has kind of double monetization of Pokemon Go when it started. Yeah. So if we look at the revenue, for example, in US, when Pokemon Go started and Monopoly Go started, the revenue is almost similar. But in this case, the revenue is coming from the half of the downloads. So revenue for downloads almost double versus Pokemon Go used to have, which again shows how that market actually grew in terms of. Okay, so if we go, that's around mobile gaming, but what's happening on the non-gaming, because of course there are also people interested in that topic as well. So in this case, if we look at the non-gaming has very strong growth still. So it's actually higher growth than on gaming side. It's mostly, of course, subscriptions, but not only. But it's what is happening is that we see the stabilization of the growth rate the same on what we had on the gaming side. Yeah, so we saw last year, I mean, this year was year of very strong non-gaming. So again, you remember the data from non-gaming, we had like almost minus 15, minus 12 year over year. The non-gaming had much higher, but we see, of course, stabilization on that side. If we look at the iOS data, is actually quite similar, with the case that now actually this total revenue on iOS side is a little bit growing a little bit faster than on Android side, especially if we exclude iOS, if we exclude China from that equation. Of course, in terms of non-gaming, the China part is much smaller than in case of gaming, but still, in general, if we exclude China, this growth will be a little bit bigger. If we go deeper and we look, okay, what are the top markets that are driving that growth? We see that growth was almost in all markets. If we look at the revenue, those are, of course, markets sorted by downloads, because, of course, in the non-gaming, still downloads probably is a little bit, I would say, better metric to measure than revenue, because a lot of those non-gaming apps are just, they have different types of monetization, including in-app monetization or some other types of monetization. But we see quite strong growth of revenue in almost all markets. But we see more and more often kind of stabilization on the download side, which means that those markets will be getting more and more competitive. Still, the biggest number of downloads, of course, by the total, is coming from India, Brazil, Indonesia. But of course, we see quite a lot of traffic coming from some emerging markets like Egypt, Vietnam, Colombia. So even like Argentina, or even very exotic like Nigeria, for example. If we look at iOS, we see, of course, China that has pretty strong decrease, but then we see pretty nice growth of the revenue in markets like India, France, Japan, for example. Again, those are like driving the most of the traffic on non-gaming. And again, at the end, if we go deeper and if we compare, okay, how actually those non-gaming apps are like, how actually they are behaving if you compare year over year, genre versus country, then it's actually getting quite more interesting, because of course those number of those categories is much higher. But in this case, we see that in general there is a lot of green, with actually with some genres or like categories that are extremely strong, like productivity, photo and video. They are pretty growing really nicely in the last months, but tools as well in most of the markets. I would say almost all categories. But of course, again, if we look at the downloads, then that growth of downloads is in general lower. So again, we see that this year was extremely strong growth of revenue, followed by pretty nice growth of downloads, but we get to the stabilization, which means that, again, those non-gaming genres, for example, user acquisition or in general in competition, will be getting more and more competitive than used to be as well. And that would be all from me. I hope it was useful. So Still, we are still in good business. We see increasing growth in many places. In general, I believe that especially for gaming, next year should be much better than this one, because again, for non-gaming, this year was pretty good, but in gaming, the next year should be much better. And actually, we see even from the growth and from the spend of the advertisers from that perspective as well. And of course, what we see is actually that more and more both gaming and non-gaming are getting more and more distributed, which means that there is more and more growth coming from non-top markets. Yeah, we see that more and more growth is coming even from markets like Poland, like Vietnam, like Argentina, which of course brings some additional values, because sometimes for smaller companies it makes sense to focus on specific markets rather than just start on US. But on the other side, of course, brings more complexity to the business in overall, because localization, monetization becomes a little bit more challenging. So that would be all from my side. That's my connection to the LinkedIn. Happy to connect with everyone who would like to connect with me. And of course, happy to answer any questions as long as there are any.